Hi guys, welcome and good morning. Welcome to the API Security webinar in partnership with F5 and NGINX. We're here live today from the studio and we will be starting very soon. If you guys are here, do like the video, click on the emojis. You can talk to us. This is AirMeet. Welcome to the AirMeet platform. For those of you who are not familiar, this is an interactive event platform. And on the right, you can see the chat window where you can chat with us while we are broadcasting. So you can put your comments and let us know if there's anything. If you can't hear, then do let us know immediately, right? If you look at the bottom, you will see a questions tab. So that's where we will be taking questions later during the session. So if you have any sessions at the end of the if you have any questions at the end of the session, please put it into the questions tab, and we will get back to you at the end of the session, right? So once again, welcome to the API Security webinar in partnership with F5 and NGINX. And today we have some very interesting segments. We will be starting soon with the panel session with our three esteemed speakers. We have Sean from F5, and then we have Dr. Lau Chahan and Dr. Suresh. And these three guys are pretty much experts in the field, and they will be here to discuss about API use cases and also security in general, right? So I will be inviting them in on a moment. Somebody's raising hands. Right, we're not taking any guests on screen at the moment. Okay, so before we go to the next segment, let me invite the speakers to the stage so that they can take over the next session.
Hello, welcome and good morning, everyone. And my name is Sean. I'm a Principal Security Advisor at F5 Labs, which is the threat research arm of F5. And today we have distinguished panel members, Dr. Suresh and Dr. Lau, who will introduce themselves in a while. And I'll be your moderator for today, and we will be asking some really interesting and tough questions maybe for application programming interfaces, because we are seeing that the adoption is really skyrocketing. And there is a lot of interest in the field, in the developer community, in the traditional infrastructure community on how to understand these new paradigms and how to secure and how to run new businesses. So without further ado, I would like to first introduce you to Dr. Suresh. Dr. Suresh, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Suresh. I'm from Center of Advanced Computing and Telecommunications. We are a cybersecurity research think tank that covers primarily the Asian region. So we do anything and everything from incident response, digital forensics, malware analysis, cybersecurity infrastructure, architecture, the whole realm. So we are more of a think tank that helps public and also private sector to manage their security infrastructure.
Thanks, Dr. Suresh. Next, we'd like to introduce is Dr. Lau. Dr. Lau, if you can introduce yourself, please.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Lau here. I'm Chief Data Scientist. I'm currently founder and CEO of LEAD. So we do a lot of training, consulting projects on AI, machine learning, and my latest project was coronatracker.com. So we provide open data through APIs to all of the 195 countries. It's widely used by many organizations, Department of Health and Ministry of Health, to analyze the data of COVID-19. So glad to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lau. That's an interesting project, Corona Tracker, right? Because we have all been trying to track it somehow or other. Let's have a quick start to our discussion today, right? And I would just start with a basic 101 kind of question. And probably this is for Dr. Suresh, right? And this is the 101 to bring everyone at level field to understand what is API and why is it becoming so important in today's technology landscape?
API essentially is exposing your capabilities out to anyone who wants to use it. So like what Dr. Lau just said, he has a site called Corona Tracker. Instead of just giving data, what he's done is build an engine around that data where people could query that information. Say, for example, if I want to know how many people have been tested positive today. So rather than just downloading a whole database of numbers, I could then fit in parameters and say, I want this particular set of data, return me that data set or subset of data. So essentially, it gives you the access to the back end of the engine. Now, where API is used today is a lot of mobile applications, they are powered by API. So what happens is, say, for example, if you're running WhatsApp or WeChat, you're submitting a line of text so that it can be sent to someone else. that gets transferred to the API of WeChat or WhatsApp. They do the back-end heavy lifting and the processing. And once it's done, they send it back to the client who's actually needs to get that particular message. So that's just an example. Another example of how you could use API is, say, for example, if you're staying in Brickfields and you want to know the postcode of Shah Alam, then all you can do is say, hey, I want the postcode number for Shah Alam, and it returns back the value of whatever the postcode number is. So essentially, it gives you the processing capability without having you to build that set of functionality.
That's an awesome answer. Basically saying abstract the complexity behind a simple API call and get the data that you're looking for.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So interestingly, right, like having spent quite some time in the development industry myself by developing applications, I realized that this kind of capacity is not particularly new. We used to have protocols like RPC, SOAP, and now REST. So I would like to ask Dr. Lau over here, as he's built a recent application, like what's the technology adoption like, especially in Malaysia? Are we seeing these new technologies being adopted, new ways of calling the APIs being adopted?
Okay, so it depends on which area, which layer we're coming from, right?
Yeah.
So if we look at the governments, our open data, some of them, a very small portion of them are exposed through API, because a lot of people, they are still wondering, like, is this thing safe, for example, or would that actually open a door, a front door, or even a back door for hackers, for example, or somebody with ill intention to enter our databases. And so the adoption here is pretty low. Now, another thing is, if we look at privates, right, MNCs and corporates, they are still very used to the traditional server client architecture. So everything that you need to connect, you need to go through like a VPN or tunneling methods, enter the company network environment before you can access the DBs. And if we look at it, I think the one with a lot of adoption is actually in startups, in modern tech company. We're very used to consume the APIs, and some of them, a lot of companies didn't realize is that whenever you expose the API, right, it helps you to streamline your operations. Say, for example, you want to switch from a web to mobile applications. If you use API, that's going to be a lot easier, a lot more secure and safer if you know how to do so. So I would say we're getting there, but the adoption rate is relatively lower.
Yeah, I believe definitely with more initiatives coming from open banking, open governance, the adoption would go up. And startups are really fueling this space because they give the kind of experience that you need, the kind of experience that is worthy of your modern mobile applications and phones that you can consume at a very fast rate.
Yep.
At this time, I would like to remind all our attendees that we have this wonderful panel. Please take time to ask your questions. We will add them along with the one that I have in particular to ask and what's going on with the APIs. Right. So, Dr. Lau, you brought in a very interesting point in your last point where you said that, okay, people are worried that whether this new way of exposing data is safe or not. In most cases, like when I talk to normal people who are not into technology space and who are just consumers of this application, practically, I don't think they even know what's running behind the scene.
If you were to ask me, of course, I will do a shameless plug-in here to promote coronatracker.com, because we are the only one in the world. There are top three corona virus tracking website, which is JHU, our site, and also the Worldmeter. We are the only one that provides open API in the sense that we have well-documented APIs, and it allows people to consume our API and build their own application around it. And actually, that's one of our so-called growth hacking strategy at the very beginning. And if we go back to your question, is that how does it solve the consumer issues? A lot of people would think that, okay, this is a consumption of data, right? So what happened is that a lot of countries, they were busy fighting the virus, so they don't have the capacity or capabilities to gather a group of data analysts, data scientists to build an engineering pipeline. But what they can do is they can gather a group of analysts to pull our data and start to do planning and start to do their academic virus modeling using our open data. And another way to look at it is that in Malaysia, we do have some of the open banking's APIs. Pemandu is driving that, BNM is driving that. but it's just that sometimes we didn't really do the marketing job so well, and yeah, there's a gap there that we should all work together to fill in the gaps. Yeah, so those are some of the examples where open API and open data can really help to facilitate and push something forward very quickly.
So if the API providers don't sanitize their API, don't practice proper coding hygiene, then it's just like any other web application that's exposed to security threats and vulnerabilities. Yeah. So in one hand, you have the API providers making sure that your APIs are secure. So for example, if you look at some of the previous application hacks, a lot of it would have the title of, oh, we've detected a data breach and someone is able to download gigs of data. Why is that so? And we only have an API. That's because there's no proper data sanitization. Someone could probably just do an IDOR, insecure data object reference, just enumerate over the API and pull out all the data that you want. That also indicates a second problem, access control. So if a user is supposed to only have access to his or her subset of data, why is it then open to all other data? Because then the assumption is no one is going to use a backend access to the API. Everybody's supposed to use the application. We have applications such as Burpsuite that allows you to manipulate and change the parameters for you to see what happens at the data set, right? Whatever data that's returned by the API. The other issue is you now have this set of data that's being returned by the API. Do you now sanitize that data? What if that data has some sort of a binary code or a malicious code that exploits your application? Because in a confederated API pool, you are essentially trusting the API provider to provide you the right kind of data back. But in this instance, we always know that whatever data that goes out and comes in can never be validated. You have to sanitize the data before you start consuming it. So it's actually a risk factor that you have to look at it both as an application provider as well as an API provider.
Yeah. So this is a follow-up question to the last points that you made, right? Excellent points with regard to authentication issues, authorization issues, insecure data object reference, etc., etc. But technically speaking, these are not new challenges. Our traditional applications have been facing these challenges for the last at least 2 to 3 decades. Then why is it that our guards and our controls fall short when we're trying to protect an API-centric application?
It's always assumed that the API will only be accessed by an application. No one assumes that they're going to run a curl command over command line and try to pull contents of the API. Nobody's going to assume that, oh, I'm just going to put 10,000 capital A characters and see what happens to the API, whether it dies miserably or it continues to survive. That's an assumption that's made, and the same assumption that we made 10 or 20 years ago, where nobody's going to put in alphabets in a numeric only field.
Yeah.
It's the assumption that you would never do this that creates opportunity for these kind of issues to happen.
Okay, so that's an interesting viewpoint as well, right? Right. People are trying new stuff. I believe it's also with the availability of so much of knowledge that's available for free in YouTube channels, or if you want to spend a little bit of money, you can get it from some dedicated hacking channels. That people are more and more willing to try these mechanisms out to actually crack open into application.
I also remember the days when I started telecommunications, it was practically impossible to get into the telco network. And the only reason was because none of the manuals were ever available and there's no such thing as internet. But today, that's not the case. Any Tom, Dick, and Harry can actually access into the core networks of a telecommunications provider if they're not secure. So you have these kind of issues in place. And also, it's all about curiosity. Everybody's curious about, can I break this? What happens if I do this? And that fuels innovation as well as other malicious activities.
Yeah. So interestingly, right, people think that, can I break this? But they forget the fact that breaking into somebody's organization is not a legal activity. I guess it happens. That's how most of the bugs are found. Right? So I would like to bring in Dr. Lau over here and ask another interesting question. And this is related to more in demand to what happens right now in the environment. In the tech space, we are seeing a lot of new technology coming in. We are seeing stuff like containers coming in, talking about microservices. So with all these things, do you think the API landscape will become even more complicated, or would there be certain kind of stabilization in understanding the process, understanding the security around it for modern applications? Dr. Lau?
Yep. So a lot of times, right, people confuse between the concepts between complexity and complication. So it's actually getting more and more complex because we are trying to get more things done on the tech space, on the internet space, and a lot of the services, including some of the fundamentals, one like accounting, auditing, and some of the legals, we're trying to bring it to online SaaS. So definitely is going to increase the complexity, but I don't think with the technology advancement it's going to become more complicated. And I would like to echo Dr. Suresh is that a lot of time it will go back to the first principle is human problems, right? Documentation. Okay, we are lazy to write documentation, so all the problem comes in. And then we are lazy to do configurations because, for example, if you're exposing a MongoDB to an API, you didn't really want to study what is the security threats with MongoDB first without understanding what is, then only you try to understand what is the security threat APIs bring into us, and also rate limiting, for example, and there are a lot more other different issues. So these are the things that I'm not sure it's a boon or bane thing, right? Like we're trying to educate more people that, hey, you should onboard API, but when too many people try to implement API without knowing what are the threats and what is the proper way to do so, that is the threat lah. But in general, I would say we're moving towards a healthy directions, and it's going to become more complex, but definitely not more complicated if you know how to do it.
That's really, really true. So my personal experience is when I started working with microservices and trying to inject security, I was like, what is this? But as you peel the layers, you try to understand things, just like everything else, it becomes simpler. Once you start understanding it, you can draw it and you can explain it as well.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to take some questions from the floor because we have few of them. And let's start with Dr. Suresh for this one, because this talks about what are the approaches of shift left in terms of API security. So I guess the question means is, with all the security stuff that we recently covered and talked about, authentication, authorization, IDOC, if somebody wants to implement this, how can this be done in a DevOps pipeline, or how can this be most effectively achieved in a DevOps pipeline?
You still have your basic sanitization process or bug management process, which is part of your CI/CD pipeline. That you can still do, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be implemented offhand. While the pipeline actually helps you to move things faster, security is still not a problem that you can solve at the pipeline level. There's still static analysis, regression analysis, unit testing. So a whole lot of tests that sometimes you just have to get it done at the point where you implement the application, because that's when you actually know what's happening. And sometimes that's actually at the later part of the build rather than the front part of the build. Because when you're talking about Agile Scrum framework, you're assuming that you know all your bugs, you're fixing all your bugs before you ship to production. That's the basic assumption. But the reality is that if that is the case, you wouldn't have issues like the recent SolarWinds hack, where a malware backdoor was inserted right at the end of the build cycle where no one could have even tested it. So we now have this opportunity where at any point of time of your pipeline, you may have an issue. The question is, how do you detect that and how do you mitigate that? So while you can say, yes, we want to move things at a faster rate, you also might end up breaking things at a faster rate. Because the other thing about fragile is it makes your system become fragile. So if you're not careful about it, then you're going to get into this problem. This is basically my experience in a bank deploying mobile applications for the masses. We've made stuff, we've broken stuff, and I can tell you, while it sounds nice and sexy, there's a lot of consideration you need to put into place to really make it production worthy.
Yeah, that's really true, like agile, fragile. But I really like the idea that we usually promoted: fail fast, but fail safe. Because once you fail in your secure network, you are still okay to go ahead and you don't cause some major kind of loss. Right. So I have another interesting question that I want to ask. This is specifically for all the viewers over here. So, and this will be to both of you. So we'll start with Dr. Lau first, right? And what technology skills do you think, specifically with respect to APIs and all the related assets, will be in demand in Malaysia or in the rest of the world in the near-term future?
I think in general, right, we are
Yeah.
moving towards more of a broader generalist skill sets. So we need more people who are able to look at the entire API as a whole, as a layer, not just somebody who are specifically look into a security part or just look into development part. And then you need to engage somebody with specific DevOps skills to look at it. And then there are some of the new positions that is very popular in the Americas, but in the US, but not popular here. For example, SRE, site reliability engineers, right? So I think what I would love to see is we grow more generalist talents so that they are able to look at things as a whole. They understand the flow. They understand all the pros and cons of different mechanism. It shouldn't be like, okay, OAuth is good. Facebook is using OAuth, so let's do that. Twitter is using that, and then you should do that. And another thing I think is the skill sets of data engineering or the pipeline, like Dr. Suresh have said, because you can't just implement a data engineering pipeline and you expect things to work magically, right? And you should require somebody who have knowledge on gathering the data and then massage the data and then put them into the pipelines and doing some sort of the DevOps jobs. Because a lot of time when we talk about API is actually very related to data engineering. So some of the data engineers here, they will be thinking like, oh no, those are the guys who do back end. They call them back end guys, and then they expect them to do those DevOps and sometimes even ML ops. And they themselves didn't even bother to pick up things like Kubernetes and stuff like that. So in short, in a nutshell, I think trust the systems, because those companies, professional companies like you guys, you know what, you are the frontliners of security. So you know what are the types of attacks, and only before AI is smart enough to help us to defend that. Otherwise, trust the systems and use the best practice.
Now, that's a very cool point that you mentioned, specifically around SRE. My SRE friends tell me, we make the developers responsible. So when something goes down, I am not the only one who loses sleep. That forces them to work properly as well.
Exactly. There are not that many occasions that I can mention the word SRE without triggering some alien look on the audience faces.
Yeah. So Dr. Suresh, would you like to add something? What are the skill sets of near-term future that you would like viewers to know about?
I guess I'm a security guy, so I would always lean towards security. But I guess it's more of like what Dr. Lau said, look at it from totality perspective. It's not just an isolation. And in the past, we've always looked at development as development, operations as operations. And now you're seeing these two domains being married together. So it is important for the development guys to understand how operations work. And it's also important for the operation guys to understand how development works. It's no longer a siloed world anymore. And now you have that triad, development, security, and operations, all running together. So it's important for us to know each other's role and understand how we could help each other. It doesn't help when operations says something that's very specific that no one else understands, or security goes around rambling about certain terms like IDOR and whatever not, and no one gets it. So the only way that if we want to improve and get it better is to understand each other's domain. You don't have to be an expert in each other's domain, like Dr. Lau said. You understand enough for you to be able to do your work effectively and help to deliver results. Because at the end of the day, organizations are not going to look at SRE, security, dev, ops. They're going to look at it, is your project developed? Is your results there? Have you launched the product? That goes down to the bottom line of any organizations.
Yeah, that's very true. Getting the results is what matters. Yeah, and also the thing that we talked about specifically with respect to security is like having additions of security champions who can actually just teach people and not make everybody a security expert. So Dr. Suresh?
Yeah, and it helps for them to talk in the same language. That's key.
Yeah. And Dr. Suresh, there's a question specifically coming towards you that I'll pick up from the floor. It talks about, so you did mention about iterated call of APIs to pull the whole data. So somebody wants to know, Binyak wants to know, what is the best approach to handle this, to make iterative API calls?
So I'll give you two solutions on how you can solve this problem. The first one is, do you check to make sure if the person actually has the right to access that data, which means access control. So if you enforce access control, then you would know whether you need to return the data subset, or you say, no, I'm not going to allow you. In some instances where the API is supposed to be open, say for example, if you're querying postcodes, the next best thing you could do is rate limit the number of access you can give it. That would give you an idea as to how much the data could put. So for example, Dr. Lau has his Corona Tracker API. Now, I want to use his API, but I don't tell him. I do a 50 query per second to pull all the data. Now his servers are going to suffer because I'm doing that speed rate. If he doesn't have that level of protection to rate limit the kind of connection that comes in and what I can pull in, essentially I've launched a denial of service attack against him. So how do you manage this? Rate limit your connections. Know what is a baseline behavior of what an average user uses. Use that as a benchmark, set your rate limit based on that.
That's cool. That's setting your blast.
Can I add on something to that, Dr. Suresh?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a very good point is that a lot of time they don't understand their users, and without that, right, and they need to have a mechanism that can manually allow people to submit application to adjust that, and that will become more flexible. That's something that we have done in the past as well. We suffer a lot at the beginning, like it's not the first thing that comes to your mind that, oh, first thing you develop an API, say, let's rate limit our users, but that's really the first thing that we need to consider.
Yeah, that's very cool. So we are coming towards the end of the session. So prior to moving to the next part of this presentation, I would like to have some closing thoughts. So we'll start with Dr. Lau first over here. Dr. Lau, your closing thoughts on API security and everything in general.
Sure. So security issue is a big topic, and it's a very important thing. But a lot of people, they didn't really want to acknowledge them. They will say like, you know what? Yeah, my site is very small, so let's don't worry about it until later. But this is like you are building a house, and then you tell your renovator, it's like, oh, it's okay. We don't need the locks yet. Don't worry about the doors. We can install it later when I'm trying to move in. But those are the things that is a common misconception when we're building our websites. So they are as important, and they should be part of your architecture and even your software design, because every single part of your application, whether it's a UI or even UX, they can potentially create some leakage. And like Dr. Suresh said, if it's not leakage, then it could jam your service, and it could potentially bring down your entire servers. And if you're on some of the services like e-commerce, for example, you have all those double 11, double 12 sales on and off, and your problem is going to grow exponentially and not linearly. So you should definitely come to professionals and get their consultation. It's not something that is cheap, but if you avoid this cost at the beginning, you're going to pay a much higher price later on. All right, I'm speaking from experience and mentoring a lot of startups as well. And as always, my point of view is it's always a human problem. So don't be lazy, do your documentation, and always test your security as early as you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lau. Dr. Suresh, your closing thoughts, please.
I guess we've spoken pretty much a lot about why it's important. I guess at this point of time, we know why it's important. Have this as part of your roadmap as early as you can, because it's going to be very difficult, like what Dr. Lau said, it's going to be very difficult, it's going to be very painful for you to now re-engineer your application once you realize that you've done all the plumbing. So it's like breaking down the house just because you made a structural issue. Yeah. So avoid a lot of these pains, start planning this from the start. You're never too small or too big to be a target of a nation state actor or a hacker or anybody who's just curious about your service. So rather than going through that pain and becoming a very expensive exercise, put it in, gradually start improving your services by having all these capabilities. You'll avoid a lot of heartaches and headaches at the end of the day.
Yeah, that was a very wonderful closing thought. Thank you, Dr. Suresh. So thank you, everyone, for listening us and all these interesting questions that you guys have posted. Please do stay with us. Now, the next portion, we will be sharing some critical insights on API and API security that we have collected. So it's a set of information that we will share on how breaches happen. So please stay tuned. Hello. We will be covering some of the stories, war stories that we have been seeing on the field and how APIs worldwide have been compromised. So quick introduction again to myself. I'm Sean. I'm the Principal Security Advisor at F5 Labs.
A very good day, everyone. My name is Ron Ho. I head the Solutions Engineering team in Malaysia for F5 and NGINX. I think without further ado, Shan, maybe we can share some of your experience and knowledge which you have gained right across not only APAC but worldwide, and some of the lessons of all these breaches.
Yeah. So let's just start with a very interesting data point about what even Dr. Suresh and Dr. Law mentioned in their last topic, right? No matter how big or small you are, you don't have to worry about the size while thinking about cyber attacks. So this is to prove what we are seeing. So at F5 Labs, we collect data. We run a lot of security apparatus around the world to see how the network traffic is like, or what kind of malicious traffic is directed like. So for Malaysia, our honeypots have detected a humongous amount of traffic, which is basically doing scanning job. So the top 3 scanners that our honeypots have detected are coming from China, Russia, and United States. So these machines are simply scanning for vulnerabilities around on the digital ecosystem. Right? So taking a step further into it, trying to look at what exactly is happening, we try to analyze what these traffic was and what they're trying to do. And this is very aligned with what we have been seeing all over the world for the last quarter, is that during the pandemic time, we saw more and more people started sharing services online or enabling work from home kind of services. And that's why there are more services online. And one of the quickest win that most hackers try to get is by trying to get access to the servers that are exposed online. And no surprise over here, when we look at what the bad IPs were doing on these particular servers, was they were trying to get SSH access, they were trying to get remote access with VNC, Telnet, RDP, and there's still HTTP and HTTPS, but the first few set of attacks are purely focusing on getting access to a service. So let's quickly move and take a look at what did we find when it came to the analysis of API breaches itself. So the first few set of data was Malaysia centric and what we saw with respect to Malaysia only. So the next set of data that we are trying to illustrate over here is coming from breach analysis. So these are real cyber attacks that have happened all over the world. So we analyzed 100 plus breaches that happened all over the world for API and try to see what's going wrong. So remember when Dr. Suresh mentioned that, okay, there are things like authentication, authorization, input validation, rate limit, all of them have been used in the field to compromise APIs. And if you take a look at it, the biggest chunk of the pie comes in the form of authentication. So now authentication is not a new paradigm. All of us know that we have to keep certain kind of security in front of our application to make it secure. But still, we find that authentication happens to be one of the weakest link when it comes to an API-centric application. The next problem was authorization, which is like around 24% of the cases. So if you look over here, right, it's more than 60% of the cases arises because of authentication and authorization. Then we have misconfiguration where people forget to implement rate limit, which becomes expensive for them or takes down the service, or even things like input-output validation. You expect a JSON request, but somebody puts a JSON bomb in between and it brings down the server. So quite a diverse landscape where we are seeing a lot of attacks going through in all possible ways that you can think of. Let's move ahead and see what's so bad and with respect to authentication and authorization. Why is there such a mess that's been created? Right? And this is to explain some of the gaps that developers and other security personnel have been leaving in their code, which causes these problems, right? The other thing is we have seen people go ahead and implement things like API keys onto their API systems, which is a decent mechanism to securing APIs, saying that have an API key. But what happens with time is there is no rotation of API key. That means there is one single static API key that has been working for probably years. And if one of the partner in the partner ecosystem person gets compromised, these keys come out in the public and they can be used to access the APIs. Another interesting example over here is how many times we have seen developers upload their keys along with the code in the Git repo. So those all mechanisms of losing the key is basically losing the keys to the kingdom. Once the key is out, people will be able to access your APIs and compromise the system as well. Next, we are seeing that people are starting to use and mature in their implementation and trying to use tokens with OAuth and JWT tokens or JOT tokens that we call them. And this is where what we see is there have been cases where the tokens are weak. That means there is no encryption over there, or the algorithm that is there does not honor the encryption, or you can simply downgrade the encryption, and which has been causing a lot of issues. We talked about OAuth implementation. There are times that people say that, okay, I just need a basic set of OAuth, so maybe I will implement a part of the OAuth by ourselves. And this is where we leave gaps in our implementation, which can be compromised to get hold of the system. Another interesting aspect with APIs like REST, people try to make it more uh, like more user friendly, and that's when they make URL endpoints guessable. That's when people are able to guess the admin endpoints, and they become a target of brute force attacks, and where people are trying to get access from. Similarly, there are things like brute force, credential stuffing, exposing internal APIs. All these collectively together form the authentication and authorization mesh that we need to take care of when we are trying to build our API ecosystem. Right. So another interesting aspect that we found out was that when we were looking into the breaches, we didn't see that it is sidelined to any individual sector or individual vertical. We found APIs across all verticals, be it government, finance, technology providers, entertainment, manufacturing, health, social media. And we found that almost all sectors had one or more breaches where these APIs were exposed and used. The surprising part is when we look at big technology line giants like Facebook and Google, their APIs were also compromised to leak data. When we look at the scale and the seriousness of some of the breaches, one government services in Asia suffered leaking a lot of national identity from their databases itself. So that was an interesting case where the whole country's data, it was a researcher who performed this, where they were able to pull down the database of all the citizens and their unique IDs. So that was a scary one, right? And just to not to mention moving far away, right? There were election campaigns that were compromised and APIs were abused over there. And this one is particularly coming from the recent US elections, where both the sides of the campaign had a mobile app which actually saw breaches on them. So those are all interesting things, that people have data and other people are just trying to get hold of that data. And that's when they will figure out any possible means or mechanisms to get access to the data, right? Here, I would like to share an interesting story or a fraud story that we have gone, that we personally have seen when it comes to the API ecosystem and when we talk about open governance and open data, right? So this story is belonging to a fintech, and the fintech had a very nice idea of saying that I will be the conduit between your bank and your utility services provider to have an easy access so that you can all do things from your mobile phone. So this is a company in ASEAN region itself. So this is how the story went. So the fintech connected with the banks over API, the fintech connected with the utility providers over the API, right? And now the fintech said, I have this wonderful API. Let's have some merchants access us and do the transaction. So everybody is trying to add value on top of it so that people can come and utilize the platform. So in this case, the merchant wants to make it more, wants to get a greater share of the user's pie. So they came up with a mobile application and said, if you use our services to do your utility payment, your mobile phone bill payment, your electricity bill payment, you can gain points with us. So the merchant is trying to retain the users to themselves. It's the economy that we are living in right now, where everybody is trying to provide value to earn their share. But in this case, what we saw was when a request was being made from the device, you get a proper response saying that, okay, you're trying to do a top up. These are the points. When you use the points, we will top up the services for you. But in this case, what they forgot was that their APIs were exposed. And if the API is exposed as a mobile banking application, people can still open the API or use the API without going through the mobile application. And in this case, when the hacker actually sent the same top up request, they simply switched the points. And even though they didn't have any points on the system, because the exact control of points to value conversion was in the mobile app banking applications UI, they were able to make a top-up request, and this request went through. And for $0, they were able to load the services, and which was the actual making of the fraud. To analyze this, to understand who in this ecosystem was faulty, was a tough job. But this is what happens when we open up APIs without having proper security in place or without taking due care of all the things that's needed to be analyzed. So that was the set of problem, right? Now let's take a look at some of the things that we should be keeping in mind when we're looking into solutions. So a quick start point for this analysis, it comes from the fact, comes from the OWASP API Top 10, which was released in 2019. So if you look at OWASP API Top 10 2019, they talk about all the serious or the top 10 serious problems that API initiators face. And this is where we also saw most of the problems where when we are analyzing the breaches. Things like authentication is broken, authorization is broken, or excessive data exposure, things that you should not be exposing to the end users, but since you're making a REST call, you're dumping the value of an object, everything goes back to the server. Lack of resource and rate limiting has been becoming very important because since now you are not one URL, you have multiple RESTful endpoints. You're giving the hackers the ability to just bombard your endpoints. And if rate and resource limits are not implemented, they might be able to bring down the whole server. So these 10 points that we see on the screen are important aspects for us to analyze and see what can be done to protect our APIs. So let's take a quick break from those things and look at what a real programmer or a real security engineer can do to actually build some of these security controls. So when it comes to access, right, enforce authentication and authorization. If you don't keep anything unauthenticated, if you have API keys, make sure that you are doing revocation and revalidation of keys. If you are building OAuth and token, have proper token validation in place. Don't use a library which allows you to downgrade your validation process by just sending in some keywords, and integrate to a proper identity store. When it comes to the API conformance part, we need to do payload validation, format and size validation, schema validation. So now this might not look new to most of us or most of the security professionals, because payload validation is something that we have always been doing, and that's what a web application firewall was. But we also need to ensure that with the new APIs, there are new templates and new formats in which these services are coming in. So it should be able to, your WAF or WAP as we call them, should be able to analyze JSON payloads, XML payloads on the fly to look for these problems. Next is malicious activity protection. As Dr. Suresh mentioned earlier, what if there is a man in the middle in between, or what if there's a bot in between, or bot is trying to do all these transactions? We should be able to analyze those and weed them out as well. Fraud prevention is an interesting use case, as we talked about in the last example itself, where we saw that since the trust was built into the factor that the APIs will only be accessed by the mobile application, which cannot really be enforced. And it can be enforced, but in most cases, people don't enforce it, because of which fraud gets into the system. And then the rest, we should still be talking about the traffic management part of it, as in how do you route, how do you translate, how do you do endpoint and URI allow list, etc., etc. So as developers, as security engineers, as security architects, for our APIs, we need to enforce all these kind of controls into the system. So coming towards the close, just quickly trying to say, what are some of the tools that are used in managing APIs? So if you look at traditional way of understanding the most of the traditional way, one of the most common place to put all the controls happens to be in an API gateway. And since when your API gateways grow complex and API logic grow complex, we have something called as an API management platform, where most of the APIs are defined and their usage and analytics is monitored. Right? So this is our shameless plug for the last second when we talk about what F5 is capable of doing and what we can actually do to enhance your API initiatives and API practice. I promise this is just one slide, and this basically talks about the deployment architecture when most people should think about of securing their APIs. So your apps can be sitting at the corner exposing APIs. They can be fronted by a gateway, which in our case, we provide best of the breed NGINX plus API gateways that can sit and do things like traffic monitoring, routing, health analysis, etc., etc. And everything is sent back to the NGINX controller, where the administrators can centrally monitor the health of the API and the API gateway as well. And in front of this API gateway layer, we can front it with a very powerful, strong box that can take care of, that can do heavy lifting of security with respect to, say, having a proper web application firewall that can analyze either it's JSON, REST, XML, whatever payload that you're looking at, can eliminate DDoS and bot traffic. And it also has the capability of allowing you to implement things like OAuth 2.0, basically taking away the complexity of managing and maintaining them in your application and doing rate limiting based upon the tokens. And when we look at this diagram, we are not saying that you should just authenticate at the edge and let everything go in without authentication. This is where we try to say that once you're authenticated at the edge, you can still do a lighter weight JWT-based validation on the API gateway so that you can achieve a zero trust kind of architecture to implement the whole solution. So this is what we had for presentation today. Prior to moving ahead, I would just like to remind most people that we do have something called as an API CTF or Capture the Flag challenge that we are hosting next week on the 18th of March. We will be sharing the details on how to register, etc. for this later on. But this is a challenge that if you are a practitioner, if you like things hands-on and you want to try it out, we have built a lab for you where you can compete with other people into hacking into a system which is API-centric system. And all the vulnerabilities that we talked about is built in there. So you can check out how to crack, hack, and learn more in the process. We do have more collaterals and literature that you can find at f5labs.com or interactfi.com. If you want to learn more about threat intels from F5 Labs, you can visit f5labs.com. We present and we write a lot of security reports on how applications are shaping, how cyber threats are shaping. So that is all for now. If you have any questions, I will be more than willing to take it.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Shan. So we have some questions on the floor, which I will actually post it over here. Firstly is by Mr. Yong. He actually asked earlier, how do you actually build a proper secure API? So I believe throughout your presentation, the past 20 minutes, you spoke about the OWASP top 10 API threats. I think organization needs to look at that deeply, critically. And also, do you have a slide to share about critical controls for API as well, where you spoke about access, API conformance, or sometimes conform to RFP standards or whatnot. Malicious activity protection, fraud protection, prevention, and also traffic management. One thing I wanted to add to that, right? So whatever you have spoke about earlier is very much in terms of technology standpoint. But I would like to add that in my point of view, also there are certain aspects where it's not really technology, like people and processes. I think we heard what Dr. Lau say. Many of the breaches are due to errors, organization errors, human errors, which actually cause some of these potential breaches. You can have best technology, but make sure your organization is skilled enough to handle all this technology. And also you need to have proper security processes in place. And last but not least, do undertake what we call it as secure coding practices of API, restrict hard coding of IDs, password, and also perform periodic or audits and penetration tests on the API infrastructure and configuration as well. So that's a quick tip over my side. Anything else to add, Shan?
No, you practically covered it all. It's as I said, it's a whole process. You need to understand the technology as well, and you need to have people skilled in analyzing what you're building, and it should be done as quicker as possible or as early as possible in the development cycle. I would also like to share that even Dr. Lau mentioned about this in his speech, that don't try to build everything, probably give something to the experts who are doing it. So instead of building an entire OAuth platform by yourself, it's probably a better idea to just consume the OAuth services from a provider rather than building a complicated thing that you want. It would be hard to manage and maintain such a services in a long run.
Okay. Thanks a lot. There's one more question which has got a lot of thumbs up, right? Because actually the audience can actually give a thumbs up to the question. By Mr. Camaro of University Technology, Mara. Thanks a lot. He's asking, there are many articles debating about handling of authentication for REST API, which goes back to your early slide, which talks about authentication authorization.
Yeah.
So he said that, I mean, he has a good point. The most famous technology to use currently is JSON Web Token, which is JWT, right? He's asking, are there any other better alternative to handle authentication? So what is your view on that? And what are you seeing across the region? Is JWT, JSON Web Token, the more commonly used? Is it secure? And any other alternatives on top of this?
So JWT is actually an area of my own interest, and if somebody wants to read it, just go to filabs.com. You will find an article from me on how to actually properly implement a JWT token, and how to, because the JWT token itself has an RFC to comply to. And when you look at the RFC to comply to, it says that, okay, you can accept a none token, which is okay with respect to the RFC, but it is not okay when you are actually implementing a production grade system, because you can switch an algorithm from RSA or HS256 to none, and you will be getting inside the system directly. So as rightly mentioned, there are multiple ways to handle it. JWT happens to be one of them. JWT is the reason why people prefer JWT is it's self-validating in nature. So what it is trying to provide you as an advantage is you don't have to do an extra lookup to get the authentication done. And that's why it is becoming highly popular. You will see it in REST tokens. Even if you look at microservices world, when you're deploying things with service meshes, it is inbuilt into the architecture where you can just conform to this. But at the end of the day, if you don't want to consume it, you still have other alternatives to it. I would not recommend, but you can still use base64 header. But yes, if you're using it, depending upon the complexity of the application on how you want to use it, you can embed a base64 header, and you can validate the base64 header by looking up the repository. Is it secure? As long as it's SSL, yes, it's secure. But is it secure for all needs? I don't think so, because then you are dictated by the strength of the SSL channel that you are having. Next, there is also API keys that have been used traditionally, and even now people use API keys. If you have a proper API key rotation mechanism and how to do it without disrupting a lot of your services, you can still go ahead and use API keys. So that still can be used. But at the end of the day, what we are seeing most being used is OIDC, which is obviously based on top of JWT tokens. You can use opaque token, but in most cases, it will be a JWT token along with OIDC or OpenID Connect used for authentication. So that's where I see the general industry trend being going. I hope that answers the question, Kamarul.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the insightful sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, one question, one last question. Of course, the other question is, can we get a copy of this slide? We will make arrangement for that. One last question is, how do we secure data through network, right? I think this question comes in, many folds, right? I think we have heard what Dr. Suresh mentioned at the network layer, which is layer 3, layer 4. The means of existing technologies like firewall, IPS, and DDoS are still critical, right? But adding onto that, these technology are no longer sufficient when we talk about API protection, right? It is no longer about securing through network, but we need to think of securing API across multiple layers. We need to look at the entire OSI stack. And hence, going back to Shanawa's presentation on the OWASP, understanding the OWASP API top 10 is crucial. And some of the critical control points which was mentioned for API, which talks about access, conformance, following standards, malicious activity, detection, monitoring as well. And as I said earlier, people and processes. Anything to add to that, Shan? I know we are on top of the hour right now.
Yeah, I won't take too much of time. Just quickly to address this question. So data is the key, like all the APIs is to access the data. So it should be secure in creation, transit, and storage. When we talk about transit, the most important thing to handle is encryption. So there are multiple ways to handle encryption specifically with respect to API call. Number one mechanism is have a channel encryption, which is our HTTPS or TLS encryption that we talk about to make it bulletproof.
Okay, so it's going back to virtual private network, IPsec, SSL, VPN, or even HTTPS type.
So we're talking mostly with respect to API. It will be HTTPS plus message level encryption.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we answered all the questions. I think that's all for our session.
Hi, guys.
Hello, Inbaraj.
Right, thank you so much for the presentation. And yeah, that was a great session. And I hope you guys had a fun time sharing all this. And for those of you who are watching at home, I guess you guys would have learned a lot of things from the 2 sessions we had. I think the panel session was great. There was a lot of interesting discussions and the sharing from Sean and Ron here as well. We have some goodies for you. We will be sharing the link to our survey form, which is on the chat right now. So if you guys tune into the live chat, we have shared the link where you can click and fill up our survey form. And once you successfully complete the survey form, of course, there's some limited spots. So if you have to do it quickly. Once you fill up the survey form, we will then reward you with some special vouchers. All right. Okay. So do check out the link on the live chat. I've shared it, and you guys can click on it and let us know what you thought about this event. All right. Okay. So with that, I would like to thank Sean again and Ron here, and also Dr. Lau and Dr. Suresh who joined us earlier for this session. It's been a great session. And one more thing, we do have the virtual challenge coming up, right? So part of this event, this is a series of events. So the first one is the webinar, of course, which is complete now. And the other part, if you look at the logo on top, it says API Security Webinar and Virtual Challenge. So there is a virtual challenge coming up, which is happening on the 18th of March. And many of you have already signed up for that as well. And for those of you who only signed up for the webinar and you feel like you want to join the virtual challenge now, do let us know and you will be able to join us. So Sean here will be conducting that session on the 18th. So that will be something very interesting. We have some exciting prizes to be won. Of course, a DJI drone, which is the first prize, and some vouchers. So this is basically to test your API security skills, right? So it's a challenge where you're going to come online, log in into the system. You have to crack some challenges within 1 hour. It's a very short event. Within 1 hour, you have to crack some challenges and win the prizes, right? So that'll be very interesting on the 18th of March. You guys can check out more details on our website. You can go to jomhack.com/API security where you signed up for this event. All the information about the virtual challenge is there as well, including the prizes and how it's going to happen. So if you haven't signed up for the virtual challenge, do sign up. We will share the link on the chat as well. All right. Okay. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for this session, and all the speakers and our moderators once again. And with that, I will catch you guys in another session. Take care.